The November rain fell softly on the cemetery, coating the marble stones with a ghostly shine. A billionaire widow, Eleanor Grant, approached her son's grave carrying white roses, only to stop dead in her tracks. Someone was already there. A young black woman in a faded waitress uniform knelt in the mud, holding a small boy who sobbed uncontrollably. Eleanor's breath caught as she saw the child's face. The same green eyes she had once looked into every day of her son's life, staring back at her now. Who was this woman? Why was she weeping at her son's grave? And what secret bound her little boy to a family that had built its empire on power, privilege, and silence? What Eleanor was about to uncover would not only shake her world, but expose truths she had spent her entire life trying to bury. Eleanor Grant was a woman who lived in a world of glass towers and private jets. At 56, she was the iron hand behind the Grant family empire, a business dynasty built on steel, finance, and a reputation for control. Her name commanded fear in boardrooms, and her wealth shielded her from the struggles ordinary people faced. But despite her power, there was one wound money could never heal: the sudden loss of her only son, Andrew, 3 years earlier in a car accident. Since then, Eleanor's life had been reduced to ritual, silence in her mansion, endless work to fill the void, and monthly visits to the cemetery to remind herself of the legacy she thought had died with him. Far from her world of privilege, Mariah Ellis lived a life that couldn't have been more different. At just 27, she worked double shifts at a local diner, scraping together enough tips to cover rent and groceries. Her days were long, her nights restless, and her only constant was the boy who gave her life meaning, her 4-year-old son, Liam. With his wide green eyes and innocent smile, he was the reason she endured the exhaustion, the long bus rides, the judgmental stares. She had no wealth, no family name to protect her, only grit and the unshakable promise she had made to someone she loved and lost. Neither woman knew the other existed, yet both were bound by the same man, Andrew Grant. For Eleanor, he was the future of her empire. For Mariah, he was the man who had left her with both love and loss, a secret she had carried in silence since the day he died. And now, 3 years later, their worlds were about to collide in the most unexpected way. A collision that would test the meaning of family, tear open old wounds, and expose just how far privilege and prejudice could reach when the truth threatened to surface. The moment in the cemetery should have ended quietly. Eleanor could have left her roses, said her prayer, and walked away. But she didn't. Something in the boy's green eyes anchored her to the spot. They were unmistakable, the same shade her son had inherited from her family line. She asked questions, sharp and cold, her tone more like a cross-examiner than a grieving mother. Mariah answered carefully, her voice steady despite the weight pressing on her chest. She wasn't looking for trouble. She had only come to keep a promise to the man she loved, to show Liam where his father rested. But Eleanor's suspicion turned the sacred space into a battleground. Within a week, Mariah's quiet life unraveled. A man in a tailored suit appeared at the diner where she worked, sliding an envelope across the counter when no one was looking. Inside was a check for $100,000, more money than she had seen in her lifetime. The note attached was brief. For Liam's future. Let him come home where he belongs. Mariah's hands shook as she folded the check back into the envelope. Home? She thought. Liam already had a home, with her. She tore the paper in half that night, but deep down she knew this wasn't the end. Eleanor Grant wasn't a woman who accepted rejection. Soon after, Mariah noticed the changes. A social worker appeared at her door unannounced, clipboard in hand, questioning the conditions of her apartment. A landlord who had always been patient about late rent suddenly demanded payment in full. At the diner, her boss hinted that complaints had been filed about her attitude. It was as if invisible strings were being pulled, tightening around her life. The whispers reached her ears, too. Customers at the diner who recognized Eleanor's name shook their heads when they looked at her. She'll never win against someone like that. One woman muttered loud enough for Mariah to hear. Another smirked. That boy belongs in a better house than this. Each comment cut deeper than the last, turning everyday struggles into a reminder of where society believed her place should be. But Mariah wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for Liam. And every night, when he curled up beside her and asked innocent questions about his father, she knew surrender wasn't an option. She had promised Andrew she would raise their son with love, not wealth, and she wouldn't let anyone erase that promise. The real confrontation came 2 weeks later. Mariah received a summons, custody papers filed in Eleanor Grant's name. The billionaire was petitioning the court for full guardianship of Liam, citing Mariah's unstable financial condition and lack of educational resources as proof she was unfit. Mariah's stomach twisted as she read the words. They weren't just attacking her, they were attacking her worth as a mother, as a black woman raising a child in a world built to doubt her. She walked into the courthouse that morning with trembling hands, clutching Liam's small backpack like a lifeline. On the other side of the aisle, Eleanor stood tall in an immaculate black suit, flanked by a team of attorneys whose shoes alone cost more than Mariah's monthly rent. The contrast was impossible to ignore, privilege on one side, survival on the other. When the judge asked Eleanor why she wanted custody, her words dripped with superiority. "My grandson deserves the best. Private schools, a secure environment, opportunities that this young woman," her hand motioned dismissively toward Mariah, "cannot possibly provide." The courtroom murmured, some nodding in agreement, others frowning at the arrogance. Mariah's turn came, and her voice cracked as she began. But then she looked down at Liam, who clutched her hand with absolute trust, and strength flooded back into her. "Your Honor," she said, her words clear and steady, "family is not built with money. It's built with love, with sacrifice, with showing up every single day. That's what I've done for Liam since the day he was born. I'm not perfect, but I'm his mother. And nothing you see on paper can measure the nights I've held him through tears or the mornings I've walked him to school." The judge's expression remained unreadable, but the tension in the room shifted. For the first time, Eleanor's certainty cracked. Her attorneys whispered urgently, but she raised her chin, convinced her influence would prevail. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, shoving microphones toward both women. Eleanor swept past them with her entourage, refusing to comment. Mariah, holding Liam close, said only 6 words before guiding him into a cab. "He is not for sale. Ever." What she didn't know was that the battle had only begun. Eleanor had resources, power, and a reputation to protect. Mariah had only truth, and the fire of a promise she refused to break. The next move Eleanor made would push them both into a fight far bigger than custody. A fight that would expose not just a family secret, but the corruption of an entire empire. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Eleanor's lead attorney unveiled the final blow, a stack of glossy photographs showing Mariah's cramped apartment, the peeling paint, the broken heater in the corner. "This," he declared, slamming the pages onto the table, "is not where a child of the Grant family belongs." Eleanor sat back with an icy smile, confident the case was over. Money always won. Mariah's chest tightened as she listened. Each word felt like a dagger. She had expected attacks on her finances, but seeing her home, the place where Liam laughed, learned, and slept, paraded as evidence of unfitness, broke something inside her. The murmurs around the courtroom grew louder. People glanced at her as if the verdict was already sealed. The judge's gavel struck once for silence. Just as the attorney prepared to rest his case, a hand rose in the gallery. A man in a dark suit stood slowly, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I have information that directly concerns this case." Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters leaned forward, cameras clicking like gunfire. It was Professor Daniel Ortiz, a civil rights lawyer known for challenging the most powerful families in the city. Mariah had never seen him before, but she recognized the firm he represented, one of the biggest in the country. Eleanor's head snapped around, her eyes narrowing. She hadn't expected him. "Objection!" Eleanor's attorney barked, but the judge allowed Ortiz to speak. From his briefcase, he pulled a folder far thicker than anything presented so far. 3 years ago, Andrew Grant began compiling evidence against his own family business. Records of fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. He entrusted those documents to Mariah Ellis shortly before his death. Eleanor's face drained of color. Ortiz continued, his voice cutting through the room. Inside these pages are contracts and bank statements showing not only corporate crimes but also the intentional concealment of Andrew's relationship with Mariah and his son, Liam. Andrew feared that Eleanor Grant would try to erase them from existence. His notes made it clear. He wanted his child raised with love, not wealth. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled, judges' assistants tried to restore order, and Eleanor rose to her feet, shouting across the aisle. Lies! Fabrications! You can't trust her. But the word caught in her throat. She had almost said she's black. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. Mariah sat frozen, her hands gripping Liam's backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. For months she had been fighting just to prove she was enough. Now, the truth Andrew had left behind stood like a shield between her and Eleanor's empire. The judge ordered the documents admitted into the record. Eleanor's attorneys whispered furiously, their confidence crumbling. Cameras captured every twitch of her face, the rage, the fear, the unraveling of a woman who had always been untouchable. But Eleanor wasn't finished. With a trembling voice that still carried venom, she spat. You think this changes anything? That child carries my blood. And blood cannot be raised in squalor. I will bury you with lawsuits until you can't breathe. Her words, sharp and bitter, hung in the air. Then, to everyone's shock, the judge leaned forward, his tone deliberate. Mrs. Grant, what you failed to see is that parenthood is not proven by wealth or lineage. It is proven by presence, sacrifice, and love. And based on what I have seen here today, Mariah Ellis has provided exactly that. The courtroom fell silent. Eleanor's empire of intimidation collapsed in a single sentence. Mariah exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Liam squeezed her hand tighter, as if he understood. But even as the gavel struck to adjourn, Eleanor's icy stare burned across the room. This wasn't over, not for her. She would fight in the shadows, in the press, in the markets. She would drag every secret into the light if it meant keeping control. And Mariah knew it. Stepping out of the courthouse into a storm of reporters, flashbulbs blinding her eyes, she realized that this was no longer just about custody. It was about survival, hers, Liam's, and the truth Andrew had died to protect. As microphones pushed toward her, a single question echoed louder than all the rest. Could love and truth really defeat money and power in a world built on inequality? Mariah looked at her son, his green eyes bright with innocence, and whispered only for him. We're not done yet. The weeks that followed the courtroom battle felt like two different worlds colliding. For Eleanor Grant, the fall was swift and brutal. The leaked documents Andrew had preserved spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed headlines about corruption at Grant Industries, regulators launched investigations, and former allies distanced themselves overnight. In the span of a month, the woman who once seemed untouchable was stripped of her position, her reputation, and the fear she had wielded like a weapon. For the first time in decades, Eleanor walked through her own city and saw people look at her not with respect, but with disgust. Mariah's world shifted too, but in a different way. For years, she had carried shame on her shoulders, working in silence, believing her love and effort would never be seen as enough. Now, she was seen in a new light. Neighbors who had once whispered behind her back came forward to offer support. Churches held fundraisers. A community that had often turned its eyes away from injustice now rallied to protect one of their own. Still, life wasn't easy. Raising a child as a single mother never is. But there was a difference now. The weight of invisibility was gone. People knew her story. They knew Liam's story. And no matter what Eleanor tried, the truth was too loud to bury again. Liam, too young to understand the complexity of what had happened, understood the simplest truth. His mother had fought for him. Every time he wrapped his small arms around her neck, Mariah felt the victory deeper than any legal document could declare. She had protected not just his custody, but his right to belong, to be loved without conditions, without price tags, without prejudice. But there was a larger impact, too. The case became a symbol. Activists pointed to it as an example of how wealth and race intertwine in battles over family and justice. Journalists wrote about the unspoken assumptions that had fueled Eleanor's case, that poverty equals unfit, that whiteness equals rightful heir, that money can erase a mother's worth. Mariah's quiet defiance had forced the nation to confront those ugly truths. For Eleanor, there was only silence now. She had lost more than her company. She had lost the one thing money could never buy back, her son's legacy. And though she would never admit it, the sight of Liam's green eyes in the papers, shining with hope instead of fear, haunted her more than any scandal. Mariah, standing on her small apartment balcony months later, watched her son chase Bubbles on the sidewalk. The world was still unfair. Bills still piled high. But she had proven something more powerful than wealth. She had proven that dignity, love, and persistence can stand even against the strongest empires. And as the sun broke through the clouds that morning, she realized something else. This story wasn't just about her. It was about countless mothers who had been told they weren't enough. It was about children whose futures were judged not by their hearts, but by the color of their skin and the size of their parents' bank accounts. It was about the millions of quiet battles fought every day in courtrooms, schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods, battles the world rarely sees, but which shape lives forever. Mariah whispered to herself as she picked Liam up in her arms, her voice steady and full of pride. They tried to erase us. But we're still here. Because in the end, this was never just about one family's fight. It was about a truth that cuts across generations. Real strength is not measured in wealth or privilege, but in the love we refuse to surrender. And so the question remains, not just for Mariah, not just for Eleanor, but for all of us, how many more mothers, how many more children must be told they are less before we finally change the system that keeps repeating the same injustice?